Hi, my name is Goodall. I've been here for the past month or so as an intern working on ordinances and helping to try to make the Midlands area a no-kill community for our animal shelters. I'm a recent graduate from Wake Forest University where I was studying biology, and currently I go to the University of New England in Maine where I'm studying animal behavior. In the future, I would really like to go to graduate school for applied animal behavior, maybe eventually get a PhD. In particular, I'm really interested in stress in animals, and that really comes from a lot of my experiences with working at animal sanctuaries in different locations around the world. I worked for a brief while at the Sloth Sanctuary of Costa Rica. That was a very interesting experience being in a third world country because compared to here at Pawmetto Lifeline, they do not have quite the standards there as well as the legislation kind of keeping them in line, so that became a very interesting experience. But I worked there directly with the sloths, with animal care, with handling, with feeding, and veterinary techniques. I did something sort of similar at the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary in Australia. That place was slightly more in line with what you'd expect in the United States. They have, very specific laws. However, I worked briefly in the U.S. at the North Carolina Zoo Wildlife Center where you were required, 90 hours of training before you could even touch an animal, whereas in Australia, first day they go, here, hold a koala. So I got into the nitty-gritty and got a lot of experience hands-on with animals very early on, just from traveling, just because the laws are significantly different. But one of the things that's been really interesting for me here at Pawmetto Lifeline is that I've yet to work with a nonprofit, and to be honest, this is really one of my first experience working with companion and pets. So it's been interesting just kind of being surrounded by dogs and cats, which of course I have a lot of experience with just in my home life. I've got a wonderful 100-pound Leonberger who lives with me up in Maine, but I haven't really done much actual work with dogs and cats, so it's been a really interesting experience. In my experiences kind of working abroad, I've seen a lot of animals that are under stress in captivity. In Australia, there were animals in quarantine that would pluck out their own feathers, and we had a Tasmanian devil that would kind of pace his cage all day. And that is kind of what sparked my interest in studying animals that are undergoing stress. So that applies not only to animals in captivity, but that applies as well to companion animals, so animals which experience PTSD, which is absolutely possible in dogs, and separation anxiety, and those sorts of things, just because the inner workings of companion animal brains are so interesting, because the rate at which they've evolved as a result of our domestication has just done fascinating things to their brain. So for the future, I would really like to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how their brain works. It's really cool. Back in 2012, there was a man named Gregory Burns, a researcher who was one of the first people to ever put a dog awake in a functional MRI. And what he found was that when he was looking at the dog's brains, that if you presented them with a food reward, the caudate region, which is really highly innervated with dopamine, which makes you feel really good, would become activated not only in response to a food reward, but also just to the presence of their person, which interpret it as you will, but you can definitely argue that in regard to that study that we're proving that dogs are rewarded by just the presence of people and have a neurological response. So I'm really interested in understanding how the dog brain works and using that to implement better training and better policy for animals. If we understand their neuroscience and understand their brain anatomy, there's a lot to be said for what we can do with that. People so often raise their voices and yell at dogs, thinking that that's somehow going to elicit a positive response from them. But humans, we can hear about 20,000 hertz, but dogs can hear upwards of 60,000 hertz. And so raising your voice really doesn't do much for them. You can be talking as quietly as possible and they're going to hear you and they're going to be able to respond to that. So it's just using knowledge of animals to get a better understanding of how we should treat them. Because all too often we treat animals as we would treat each other, and really it comes down to we need to understand their brain anatomy in order to best fulfill, training success. Another interesting example is how people yell at their dogs if they've been at work all day and they come home and the dog's ripped up a pillow or gone to the bathroom on the floor. And although dogs have very long-term memory, and they also have really great associative memory, which is how they can recognize, places they've been and people, they have a really bad short-term memory, about 5 minutes. So if your dog does something bad and you aren't back to catch it within a 5-minute interval, he's going to have no idea what you're talking about. So you're yelling at them, and then the associative memory comes into play, and they're going to start remembering that you yelled at them for what they think is no reason. So it's really just getting a good understanding of how animals are functioning at a neurological level that would really help us to work with them better. Because one of the things that I find so interesting is that we have domesticated dogs in a way that is almost unseen in any other animal. There have been recent studies in Russia of a man that's been domesticating silver foxes, and just the rate at which they're domesticated is unbelievable, but you're starting to see in those foxes what we see in dogs, which is retaining neotenic traits such as floppy ears and big eyes and certain color patterns. And it's really interesting to look at both the physical changes that happen with animals when you're breeding them for non-aggressive behaviors and breeding them for situations in which they're going to be around humans. So it's really interesting that we've specifically bred animals for this purpose, and we want them to serve us in ways like being service animals and being working dogs, and yet we sometimes just completely deny them, the basic understanding of the way in which they think and the way in which they learn. So that's something I'm really interested in kind of studying further. In particular, it's interesting as well to look at the differences between a wolf and a dog, because in essence, according to the biological species concept, these two animals are technically the same species. They can reproduce and make fertile offspring. And if you look at the differences between the neurology of a wolf and a domesticated dog, you see some amazing differences, and that comes through in animal behavior experiments. If you look at a wolf in a laboratory, they see that wolves will not make any contact with humans, any eye contact, whereas a dog in the same situation will make direct eye contact with humans. And although that doesn't seem like a particularly interesting or important facet, it really is when you think about babies and gazing behavior and how babies learn by watching. And then they also find that dogs are much more likely in the laboratory to seek out novel new objects, whereas a wolf tends to stay with familiarity, not go outside of its comfort zone. So it's really interesting just to see how even two very similar specimens, a wolf and a dog, have become so different just by our artificial selection. So I think that's something that in the future we'll get a lot better at now with these functional MRI studies, and hopefully I'm hoping that these studies will be used to implement better policy. If we understand the brain and we have these scientific stats and we're understanding everything that's going on, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to go to our elected officials and say, hey, look, we know that dogs respond this way. We need to improve their captivity and other aspects of their lives to the best that we can. It's one of those things where I think often people write off animals as being property, or they write them off as objects, but just the way in which we have caused them to evolve is amazing, and they should be treated with the best policy possible. And I think that Pawmetto Lifeline is really on the right path with trying to not only understand these animals, but implement policy that's going to protect them and hopefully make people realize their full potential.